I was saying that, okay, I reserve the term ideology for processes, patterns of frames of interpretation that are related to social issues and social relationships. So for instance, I would not call a discussion about the shape of the earth as an ideological thing unless, and that's very important, unless this is linked up to all kinds of other issues, like for instance, the Catholic Church that takes a specific position and tries to enforce this and so on, and then it becomes an ideological issue. But I can imagine discussions that have nothing to do with social relationships, and therefore I wouldn't talk about those in terms of ideology. Even though, for instance, within the sphere of the development of sciences, within specific, again, institutional contexts, the debates between specific scientific positions that apparently have nothing to do with social relationships might also get social stuff inserted into it. Okay, now, so it's rather complex. It's a principle, but it's not always so easy to handle it. Then the next very important thing is that what this is about is frames of interpretation that are accepted as commonsensical and that therefore become normative. For instance, if this guy from the tolerant majority responding to the extreme right who says we can take away their nationality again, and he says also for those who have integrated themselves, then this brings along the normativity of this concept of integration as if it is something that is simply given and not open for dispute. It is carried along as commonsensical. Okay, so these are important ingredients of what goes on there. So frames of interpretation in the social sphere, which are functioning in a very commonsensical way, and which therefore usually escape questioning. And so those things which tend not to be questioned openly within a given debate, well, those are the interesting things to look at if you want to look at ideology. And at the same time, having said that, this immediately brings out an important methodological principle. Because if what we are looking for is frames of interpretation that are commonsensical and not openly questioned, then the basic principle of research to apply is questioning, right? So simply questioning what is going on there, questioning aspects of meaning. And that is where then these sub-theses 1.1 and 1.2 come in, and I'll just read them for you. So the common sense, basic normative nature of ideological meaning is manifested in the fact that it is rarely questioned in a given society or community in discourse related to the reality, quote unquote, in question, and possibly across various discourse genres. And then 1.2, it's not being questioned means that the meaning concerned is often, though not always and not exclusively, carried along implicitly rather than to be formulated explicitly. And it is at that point that methodologically, this whole apparatus of notions that has been developed to describe forms of implicit meaning in the field of linguistic pragmatics, that this comes in as an extremely handy tool to apply in this type of research. Now, then, okay, why is this important? Well, for me, actually, the basic data that I use as illustration materials in ideology in language use, well, my path towards those data was actually triggered by finding on a flea market a little book which is called Histoire Générale, General History, which at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries was an extremely widely used history textbook in France. It was supposed to capture everything that primary school kids ought to know by the time they entered secondary education. Okay? So, and this was extremely widely used. Well, French public education being quite centrally organized, you can imagine that if a textbook was used, it was used everywhere. Okay. Now, in this little textbook, in the preface, I found this one specific sentence that then further set me on the path towards the Indian Mutiny. Namely, it said, à côté de ces œuvres de la politique et de la guerre, nous avons mis les œuvres de la paix, industrie, commerce, colonisation du monde. So he says, well, okay, this book being a book of history, it deals with a lot of politics and wars and stuff like that. But next to these works of politics and war, we have put the works of peace. So industry, trade, colonization of the world. Now, I can, well, okay, I see smiles here. Huh? So you smile at that kind of categorization, right? So, because what this is all about is categorization. You categorize colonization under the label of works of peace. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that in those days, those school kids, they were not smiling about that. They thought this was common sense for them. Yeah? This was absolute common sense. Okay, I still, my earliest childhood years were still childhood years when Belgium had the Belgian Congo as a colony. We didn't think twice about what colonization meant. Not when we were kids, but it's at that age that you get the formative years, of course, of your thinking about all kinds of things that are happening. Now, so then the point here is, and this brings me then to another extremely important aspect of ideology, when that is what we want to talk about, and which I tried to capture in the second thesis that you also find in the book, which says, ideology, because of its normative and common sense nature, may be highly immune to experience and observation. What do I mean by that? Well, in this specific case of this history textbook, categorizing colonization as a work of peace, the fact that colonization went hand in hand with warfare, conquests, revolts, the crushing of revolts, and all the violence that was involved there, no attempt was made to hide that. No. In the same textbook, if you looked at passages about that had to do with colonization, it was always about such things. Namely, that area was conquered in that year, it was a hard-fought battle, right? There was a revolt then, it was crushed in this way, and so on and so forth. Sometimes there is also a little bit of talk about trade, yes, but mostly it is these violent things that were being talked about. And this is not only to be found textually. I'm not going to go through this little French text, which is about the period of the so-called Indian Mutiny, or the First Indian War of Independence, 1857. But you also get visual representations of the violence, right? Because what is happening here, leaders of the revolt are tied to the mouth of cannons, and those cannons are shot. Well, pretty violent. Not your ordinary type of execution, if there is such a thing as an ordinary type of execution, but this is extreme violence, what you get visually portrayed there, but still that does not shake the categorization of colonization as a work of peace, right? So that is the power of ideology, and it's easier to see this in historical data than to see it in the present day, because we are always living in a present in which we have absorbed frames of interpretation that we may very often not be fully aware of ourselves, and which we also just carry along in our interpreting what is happening. So doing research on actual current data is to a large extent harder than seeing this in historical data, which is in fact why I took the easy way of using only historical data as illustration materials in that textbook. It was the easy way out in a way. Huh? Now, okay, this now brings me back then to basically where I started with what I was saying about 15 minutes to go, right, before I have to stop. Yeah. Well, yeah, maybe I should ask at this stage whether there are questions now. Yes.
So you're defining ideology as a normative frame, but that, I mean, in other discussions of language ideology, you know, that's not really a way that they sort of describe it, because all of these other sort of counter frameworks or non-normative ideologies also affect, you know, the ideological field, and you know they have the potential to become normative at some point or not. So,
yes.
So then why do you choose to restrict?
No, that's a very important remark that you're making there. Now, there is another aspect to this, which was actually, if you look at 1.1, there is the specification in a given society or community, right? And within every large-scale society, there are different sub-societies and communities which may be living by their own ideologies, right? And that's ideology is not normative in the sense that it dominates everything. There's not one ideology that necessarily dominates everything, though an important aspect of ideology is that it may strive towards hegemony, and it's only the hegemonic ones that are really wide, that achieve hegemony, that are really widespread. But in the same societies where you get a hegemonic ideology, you may still get communities that live by their own ideology, which do not fit into that general paradigm. So that's a very important remark to make. So it's not as if we would be talking about something that absolutely, totally dominates things. Even in the period where it was common sense to categorize colonization as a work of peace, also in those days there was contestation. So there was contestation against colonial practices in England, in Belgium, in various places. But the point is, these voices, they remain marginal, okay? So it is not as if the marginal voices do not exist. Of course they are there. And the normativity is only, well, it does not necessarily capture the whole of a population, which is a good thing. Otherwise you could never get any form of development there, right? So is that a sufficient answer to the remark you were?
Ideology is not necessarily normative.
Oh, it is. It is within those sub-communities that are developing. It develops its own form of normativity within that community. So I think it is an essential characteristic there.
In the way of defining ideology, there seems to me to be a movement of occultation. Something is being hidden, as it were. Something is being consciously passed off as common sense, as a frame of interpretation, so that it's not questioned. That seems to be a strategic movement of discourse itself, in the way in which it organizes itself. In the classic deconstructionist mode, one would say that if we deconstruct the discourse, it will also topple that dominant ideological meaning in some way. So I'm just wondering, in terms of your work and the kind of examples you were talking about, especially in the specific Belgian context, did you have situations like that where you could see that the dominant intentionality of a hegemonic ideology was internally deconstructed by the discourse itself?
What do you mean by being internally deconstructed by the discourse itself?
So it's like, okay, so if there is a manifesto that preaches fascism, there is also a certain anti-fascist meaning that creeps in, as it were, against the grain or the intentional grain of the text. So in that sense.
Yes, yeah, I see what you mean. So it is definitely the case that in every form of discourse, other voices are brought in necessarily, because otherwise there is no positioning, right? And that in itself may indeed, as you suggest, develop into the source of a change in the old. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, totally agree. Rukmini, you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to say, in terms of your earlier discourse on categorizing, you might say that every category carries within itself the meaning potential for its contradiction.
Absolutely.
Just in terms of the terminology that he was using of categories, that the meaning potential of categories is decategorization.
Yes.
So
Yes, absolutely. But this is a very basic pragmatic principle as well. It is part of the choice making that takes place. Choices are always made from a range of alternatives, and whatever choice is made, it brings in the potential of the alternatives as well. So definitely, yes. Yeah.
Just one more small point, which is to do with the notion of development. What constitutes, development is part of the, a discourse of progress. We Marxists recognize it, but I don't know that you are using development in that sense. Because, we belong to a society where the word development crops up every 2 minutes. And it's,
no, I mean change.
So you mean change,
yes,
and not development in the sense of, I think that ought to be clarified because of the way in which we think of, it sort of goes in one direction for us because of the, we are described as developing societies, and it's problematic.
Thanks for the clarification. Yeah, what I mean is simply change when I use the term development. Yes. Yeah. But there was another question there, yeah?
No question.
Yes.
It's not entirely a question. This is like an extension of what is already discussed by the two friends sitting on the left. It came across from your presentation so far that the ideology probably carries negative connotation as you presented. Because this, you immediately said in the response that it tends to be hegemonic and then it spreads and it takes things. There's one definition that Van Dyck gives, that it's a shared community attitude. That's the one definition that he gives. Though he also talks about very critically when he goes ahead and talks about, he's also critical discourse analyst, so he also looks at as a frame of interpretation which hides a thing. So how do you respond to this very basic definition that ideologies are shared community attitude which binds things together?
Well, that's another way of defining it, yes. And if you say that, yes, the way I've been talking makes it sound as if I look at ideology as something totally negative, sorry, that's not the intention, because there is no way of avoiding ideology, you know, and there are extremely positive ideologies as well. Anti-racism is an ideological framework, right? So feminism is an ideological framework. So there is nothing inherently negative about ideology. It's just the case that there is no way in which we can avoid ideology, because there is no way in which we can talk without carrying along things that we take for granted. There is no way. But that doesn't make it less important to study these processes, because they may have quite detrimental effects as well. That's the reason. Any more questions? Yes.
So going back to what both of you were kind of, hinting at, so what I want to ask is, I mean, I think you're borrowing on Derrida when you say that. So I have two questions and I'm a little confused right now, but let me articulate what I'm thinking about. Is it that a hegemonic discourse is not possible at all because of the fact that oppositional reading is always present in the text first? And second, what kind of readers what kind of reading is required and are necessary for that kind of deconstructive reading? Do the masses have access to that kind of reading?
Yeah. These are, what was the first question again?
Is a hegemonic...
Yes, hegemony. Well, of course, hegemony is never complete, right? So that doesn't mean that there isn't such a thing as hegemony. There is. So there are very hegemonic patterns, but they are never really complete. There is always counter movements. So that's the answer to the first question. Then, can the masses read the things that we need to be able to understand in those processes? I think personally that this is a major educational task. It is the kind of thing that you can make possible by means of forms of mass education. It is possible, but there is a big problem there, in the sense that you cannot organize aspects of mass education without, or at least in most places you can't, you cannot organize it without political goodwill. And for instance, if I were to try to, I could try to strive towards having a kind of influence on educational processes in a country like Belgium, but it would have to be done in a very subtle way, because completely openly, for education in a country like Belgium, you need government money. As soon as you would be doing things that would be too confronting for the powers that be, the finances would be shut off, and it would become extremely difficult. So there are only relatively indirect ways of achieving that goal. So you can try to achieve that goal by, for instance, okay, you can be teaching at the university, and the students that you teach at the university, they will be bringing some of the things that you teach them with them when they go and teach in high schools and things like that. And you can only hope that that is a kind of educational process that raises a level of awareness about these types of processes that makes it possible for people, when they are confronted with a discourse where they get the feeling that there may be something wrong there, that they have the tools available to also say what's wrong there. and to see what's wrong there. And one of the and certainly I think that one well, if there is one thing that I think I can be a little bit proud of, is the fact that after the research that we did on these migration issues in the early 1990s, there was a whole group of other people, mostly higher educated people with migrant backgrounds, who themselves were given tools to contest the majority discourse. And they also started doing that quite extensively. Problem is that they themselves also tended to get marginalized. And again, there are hegemonic patterns that are taking over. And I can say a few more things about that in a minute. Is that sufficient? Yeah. Yeah. You want to say something?
Comment again. No.
Yeah.
You said one thing that you could be proud of is the fact that people in the migrant communities were enabled by the research. But the phrase you used was given tools. Now, for this, and one of the things that we are debating in India with regard to many communities and empowerment is the notion of experience and tools. So the experiential world of the migrant or the experiential world of the Dalit may be very different from the experiential world which created those tools. In other words, there would be two different ideologies. So my question really is about the role of experience itself as a tool, and that which may be at odds with the tools that are given to you. And one of the things is we take tools given to us from the world community, and I myself believe that learning belongs to everyone. It doesn't belong to one community. But this notion of giving is a very problematic. The word root is data. Datum. Data. To give. And one of the problems is the ambiguity of the act of giving and experience. So could you comment on this argument at some stage, maybe not now, on this argument of learning, but experience as a tool, experience as a way of understanding, which as non-Dalit or non-woman you cannot understand, because I am very conflicted about this. I don't know whether
No, but that's an important point. So my experience is that, when I say they were given the tools, I should have put it differently. So they managed to appropriate the tools, and they could do that much more efficiently because of their own background and their own experiences, right? So they could bring in a whole lot of stuff there that I had no idea about. So if you're not part of a specific community, then you also don't have the right to speak in their name, right? So I feel that very strongly also in the case of specific class differences. Like, my own background is totally working class. So my father was a bricklayer. His father, well, he was called the odd jobs man, right? That's the kind of context that I come from. Growing up in a very rural area, which is, of course, if you compare it to rural areas in bigger parts of the world like India, doesn't mean very much, because it was only about 40 kilometers from Antwerp, where I'm living now. But at that time, that seemed a very big distance. Now, so growing up in a rural area, working class family, I have that experience, but I have totally, completely grown away from that. I do not feel that I can make any statements for working class people today in Belgium. Absolutely not. Even though part of my own family is still to be situated in a working class atmosphere. So I don't have any experience there anymore. In the same way with people with migrant backgrounds, you can try to understand a number of things, but in terms of forms of social action that can develop by means of the availability of specific discursive tools, for instance, well, that can be done much more effectively by people who do have the relevant experiences. But Jenny, you want to say something? Yes.
Perhaps one of the, because I'm fascinated by the fact we're having this conversation, and yet the thing that I thought was a burning issue in Belgium from long ago is the language that you speak. Is it Flemish, and if so, what kind of Flemish, and where are you situated geographically in relation to another language area? I mean, language is the big ideological issue over what, a century or longer. And so if we start thinking about talking about migrant communities, and there's a lot to say about the notion of community, but it's in fact, we got to talk about the actual, spoken language, the spoken means of speech that people have. So, if you've been, the multilingualism of all the migrant communities, but I'm more interested, if you can talk about your background, in the issue of the role of Flemish and the ideology surrounding language use right now. Not only right now, but back over historically, over the last century or so.
Well, actually, I was going to come to the issue of language ideology.
Let's get there pretty fast.
Okay. Yeah, there's just 5 minutes.
Yeah, we're going to have coffee. But afterwards, maybe we can get there, because I think it's so very... I learned, remember, I'm a total outsider to this, but I learned how incredibly vital it is, and also how it's been twisted and used by the right wing. What do they call them? So Flemish.
Well, they used to be called. Well, there are different ones. There are some that call themselves Flemish Bloc, which is now which renamed itself after they were actually tried for racism. But the only thing that they had to do was change the name, and then there is another move.
Almost standard language, and then there's this issue. You see, if you're raised, like over your, you talk about your ancestry. Is that standard? Was that a standard Flemish? And in what way did Flemish become a standard in a country where the end of the 19th century was the time when there was this big ideological shift towards French being the language of power, and then now it's tilted exactly the other way, because economically it's tilted the other way. The power is not with the Walloons. And then there was the issue of the non-standard French.
Yeah, so maybe I can use these few minutes to give this historical background that Jenny is referring to. So, okay, Belgium is a country that hasn't been in existence as a country until 1830. And in 1830, it was created relatively artificially. It had been just before that. It was part of it's been part of all kinds of things. It's been occupied by the Spanish. It was part of the Habsburg Empire, the Austrians. It was then for a little while incorporated in Napoleon's empire. Then it became part, briefly, of the Netherlands. which was then coextensive with what is currently the Netherlands and what is currently Belgium. And then in 1830 we got the Belgian Revolution, which separated Belgium from the Netherlands. And in Belgium, so when the state was started, well, there was, well, Flemish was spoken by the majority. It was a numerical majority, but the Flemish part of the country was economically totally underdeveloped. It was an agrarian area, society, and so the real industry at that time, and Belgium actually was a very, very advanced industrial state. So, but all the industry was situated in the southern French-speaking part of the country. And at that time, basically, French simply became de facto the official language. So the existence of another language was recognized, but for most official purposes, French was the language. For instance, there was no higher education in Flemish. There was only higher education in French. Many court cases were only tried in French, and so on and so forth. So, and then that, of course, created a lot of resentment, and so a Flemish movement started, quite successfully, actually, leading to the establishment of Flemish-speaking university in the early 20th century, leading to the legal obligation for courts to handle people in their own language. These sorts of things, these kinds of legal regulations were developed gradually. And then at a certain point, this went so far that we established something that's probably unique in the world. Namely, we established a language border. So we fixed a physical border, south of which the official language is French, north of which the official language is Dutch. I say, and it may be confusing, I use Dutch now and not Flemish, because actually Dutch is, well, the language we speak in Flanders is perfectly mutually intelligible with what is spoken in the Netherlands. There are differences like between British English and American English, or British English and Indian English. So there are these kinds of differences, but it's mutually intelligible. And so officially we call our language Dutch. And there is a good political reason for that, of course, because that makes us bigger. Right? So whereas in other parts of the world they try to emphasize the distinctions for political reasons, we try to emphasize the unity for political reasons, right? And
one more thing that gives it surely a parallel with, I mean, you're not parallel, but you see the same resonances in India, and that is religion.
Mm-hmm.
You see, the reason for the existence of Belgium, as far as I learned my history, was that on the other side, I don't know what's on the other side of the border, what? What's the matter? Oh, it's on. It's on, though. Do you agree? Hello. Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to raise the religion issue. That as far as I understood it, the reason why Belgium came to be is northern Belgians, who are the southern Netherlanders, was Catholic, and it was the most bitter war between Catholic and Protestant that lasted, what was it, 80 years, 100 years? I mean, it was a war of immense slaughter. For the size of the population, and it was between religions. Mm-hmm. So we got the two languages, the two religions. You know, we got a lot of parallels there.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well.
Tiny space.
Okay. This again is another very important issue you're bringing up for the history of Belgium. So actually, for a long time, what is now Belgium and the Netherlands in the past were also more united in a variety of ways, not as one unity, until the 16th century. And then at the end of the 16th century, the Spanish, and that was in the middle of those religion wars. So at the end of the 16th century, so the Spanish took full control over Antwerp. And in Antwerp, there were lots of Protestants at that moment. Now, they were at risk. So Antwerp at that time was a city of over 100,000 people, so it was a big city at that time. But in a matter of 2 years, it got cut into half, and the other half left for Amsterdam. So, and that's when Amsterdam became an important metropolis there. So there is a long history of separation there, so a couple of 100 years of total separation, which had as a result that indeed there was still the religious contrast, with the Netherlands being perceived as Protestant, and I say perceived as Protestant because the majority of the people in the Netherlands are Catholic, but the center of power is Protestant, so it has been Protestant for a long time. So there is that, and Belgium remained very Catholic as a result of the Spanish occupation and everything that followed that. Okay, so let's continue. I promised that we would be getting down to language ideology. Yes, that's because I just want to continue to illustrate the importance of ideological processes. And probably the best way of doing that is by going back to the kinds of issues I started out talking with, namely discourse surrounding issues of diversity that I studied in the 1990s, but these issues have not gone away, of course. And so if I then look at the way in which that type of discourse has, well, I shouldn't say developed, but changed, that discourse has changed towards what it is like in, well, today, then I see that there is a very general kind of development that has taken place, which is a development of some kind of a new normal in the public sphere in relation to issues of diversity. So what used to be normal and mainstream, which was what I characterized earlier as the tolerant majority and the position that they took. So what used to be normal or mainstream was an explicit acceptance of diversity, but an underlying, what I would call an homogeneistic ideology, an ideology that, according to which the ideal of a societal structure would be a society which is as homogeneous as possible, in which everybody basically is as similar as possible. So, and that's what the whole concept of integration was used for in those days. That was the normal. But so integration was at that time an instrument, let's say, to control diversity. But a non-acceptance of diversity was really restricted to what was at that time the extreme right. And in connection with that, there was a use of the notion, an interesting use of the notion of democracy. Because the tolerant majority was really a bit scared about this movement towards an extreme right. And so what they did to contain the danger was to define the extreme right party as non-democratic. And this is a very interesting thing, because what this did was to reduce a very complex notion, the notion of democracy, to a bipolar opposition between democratic and non-democratic. And by defining the others as non-democratic, by definition, they themselves became fully democratic, and they could stop asking questions about what it really meant, democracy. And if you start a discussion about the meaning of democracy, then okay, one of the basic ingredients must certainly be that within a democracy, every individual citizen must be able to participate in the society as fully as possible, which means that you cannot have any form of democracy without leaving space for diversity. But that discussion was totally avoided by reducing this complex notion of democracy to a bipolar opposition. That was the normal in those days. But some kind of a new normal has developed in which an explicit problematization of diversity has become totally acceptable. So nobody shies away from problematizing the diversity that is there. And in combination with that, what you get is a very explicit homogenistic ideology, which presents a model of society that emphasizes societal cohesion, which is viewed in terms of sharing views, sharing norms, sharing values, sharing interests, and sharing language. That's where language then comes in. Now, this development of a new normal can be analyzed in terms of a couple of tools that were used in this development. And one of those tools, the first tool that I want to draw your attention to is some kind of an anti-discourse, which puts itself in opposition to other discourse. And this is a discourse that targets what is labeled political correctness. And political correctness, about political correctness and the discourse that handles political correctness is said to show an inability to see reality. It is said to manifest a refusal to understand the people. So it's a populist kind of thing, which presents itself as really representing the people in general, just like Trump does. Okay, it is also characterized by it also characterizes political discourse, showing political correctness as manifesting an injunction against telling the truth. It says, well, they're just afraid of telling the truth, and what you get as a result is some kind of process reversal, because a new kind of politically correct is developing, very similar to what you would want to call Trump talk. That is becoming a little bit of a norm. Now, another aspect of one aspect of the anti-discourse in relation to the discourse about diversity is that and I'm giving just one specific instance of that, one case in point, which is the relativizing of racism. And what I'm giving here is a quotation from a person in power, a woman who is actually responsible for minority issues. She's responsible for the issue of integration in Flanders at this moment. She's really at the very top there in the government. And she makes the following claim. She says, this is of course a translation, but I think it's a good one: racism is a relative concept. I deplore that the word is used so quickly today. Is there still racism? Probably yes, on the part of the autochthone population with respect to the allochthone population. Probably yes. The other way around, that too. But today, racism is mostly used as an excuse for personal failure. Now, this is a person responsible for handling minority affairs, right? Now, So this is really totally, completely open at the very top of the discourse. There's no attempt anymore to hide anything. No, a very clear position is taken there. Now, if you analyze this, this little stretch of discourse, then you see it has a very interesting structure. I hope you can read it there. So it starts with a purely descriptive statement, which says racism is a relative concept. Then it goes on to an evaluative statement. I deplore that the word is used so quickly today. And this is a direct attack on political correctness, right? Then you get a response-controlling embedded concessive structure, which consists of 3 question-answer pairs. So the first question-answer pair is about the existence of racism. Is there still racism? Probably yes. Second question-answer pair is a further specification of that. So on the part of the autochthon population with respect to the allochthon population, probably yes. Now for those of you, well, is everybody familiar with those terms? No. Okay, so I have to explain this briefly. So in the discourse about minorities in a Flemish context, there are always ways of trying to change terminology just in order to avoid negative connotations and so on. And at a certain moment, they thought they could avoid negative connotations by introducing these semi-scientific terms where the originally local population would be called autochthonous, which is a term which actually comes from geology. And in geology, it refers to stones and sand structures that have not been displaced, right? And allochthon would be referring to geological formations that come from somewhere else, okay, that do not really belong there. So if similar terminology would have been taken from not from geology but from biology, it would have, well, the equivalent of allochthon would have been exotic or something like that. So that's the kind of thing. Okay, so is that clear? So autochthon versus allochthon.
Indigenous we use a lot.
Uh-huh.
Indigenous population, and then of course like non-indigenous.
Yes.
And we also have words like Adivasi and so on. So we have a sort of parallel set of many terms along this. Indigenous, everybody knows?
Okay. So that was the second question-answer pair. So on the part of the autochthon population with respect to the allochthon population, probably yes. And then the third question-answer pair is, in fact, an expansion. The other way around, that too. Now, there's something interesting about that. Well, I call this an expansion because, well, most often when there is talk about racism, it is about relationships, or it is something that is directed from a majority to a minority. The notion is expanded by reversing the relationship. But what is very interesting here is, what is interesting about these 3 question-answer pairs? Do you see something special there? Well, in 1 and 2, yeah.
So I just said she's including everything. Including all aspects. So same sort of stuff.
Yes, but there's something else going on here linguistically.
There's iteration. There's iteration.
Yeah, it's a nice build-up. It's a good rhetorical structure.
There's the tone is a little flippant, and there's self-evidence within those statements. So when she's expanding on the third one, it's something that she's putting forth is very self-evident. But in actuality, reverse racism is really a thing.
Yeah. So the emphasis really comes on the third statement, also because the first two are mitigated. Probably yes, but then the third, that too. Okay. And when it's brought forward as something that is really, really self-evident, and it's really becomes the emphasis, and it is that move that makes the final explanatory statement easy to make, where you get a narrowing to the agents of the expanded notion. Because then she only talks about the position that minorities take. And she says they abuse the notion of racism, right? They use it as an excuse for their own failure, right?
Minorities, you know what's interesting about that last statement is it's a generalization.
Uh-huh.
So it doesn't mention minorities.
No.
But we all know.
Oh, we all know. Yes, yes.
It is minorities. It's
Absolutely.
very right?
Yes.
So
absolutely.
Racism is mostly used. It could
Yeah.
logically belong to either,
Uh-huh.
but it clearly does not. How
Yeah.
did we get that implication? So maybe without the expansion,
Mm-hmm.
we would not have
No,
so strongly captured.
that's right. That's right. It is the expansion that enables the, yes.
Generalization,
Yeah.
from which we are always saying it's only the minority.
That's right, yes. Whereas in fact, it is very clearly in its meaning a narrowing down to a statement about minorities. Yes, yes. So if you look at rhetorical structures like that, well, it can become very interesting. Now, in this, well, what is also part of the, was, okay.
Hello. So, because we are doing a bit of linguistic analysis, so just a thought of thinking about the metaphorical import with the word that belongs to geology.
Yeah,
so,
but which is not felt to be a metaphor because nobody knows the origin, you know.
Okay, but
so it's just used as terms.
Okay, yeah. So then what is the importance? Even if people don't know, but still you bring the, so it is like to obscure the thing. Like what is then the purpose of using the word which belongs to? It is like to obscure certain thing.
It is. It has a long history, of course. Now, so the talk about minorities, has undergone many changes. So in the very beginning, when in a country like Belgium, people were brought in to work in the coal mines, they were called guest workers, right? But the term guest worker, in fact, only contains positive elements. Guest, worker, should both be positive, but still the combination developed very negative connotations, which already indicates that there's something strange going on there. If you have a very positive term which develops negative connotations, something strange. And so the need was felt to get away from these negative connotations, and then the next interesting step was that they were beginning to call them migrants. Now, why do I say this is interesting? Because this is literally, and I have to go into the details of specific linguistic details. In Dutch, the term migrant, which is the literal equivalent of migrant, it didn't occur in any Dutch dictionary, not at all. We had other terms for migrants. So, okay, well, it won't tell you anything, but the term for, we had a term for somebody coming in that was either an inwijkeling or an immigrant, an immigrant. That term was commonly used. We also had emigranten, so people leaving the country, but the term migrant itself, as such, didn't occur in the Dutch. It had never been used really in the Dutch language. So why was it created at that moment? It's a very interesting thing, because the term was applied to a group of people, the majority of whom had never been in a migration process. There was only a migration background. the majority of the people already at that time were born in the country. So you're talking about second generation and even third generation immigrants. So the you cannot make an intentionality statement about this, because I have been warning against against that before. And maybe there wasn't even any intentionality involved, but there was definitely a meaning effect involved. Namely, by labeling this category migrants, you do not describe them as people who are at the end of a migration process, because then they would be immigrants, right? No, you leave open the option for them to leave again. And that was also very much part at that time of the political discourse. We should encourage them as much as possible to go back, right? And in the extreme right, the case of the extreme right, it would be, okay, let's just send them back, okay? So whereas within the majority also, everybody knew they were there to stay, still you get the creation of this term that leaves open the return option. But then, okay, then for a while that term was in use, but didn't last very long until also this term got exactly the same negative connotations as the term guest worker got before that. And then, okay, yes, so the need was felt to try and find other terminology that might get rid of those negative connotations, and then they introduced this semi-scientific terminology. Now, and there are lots of other things in terms of terminology that are happening as well, you know, like the most recent invention in a Dutch-speaking Flemish context is the term transmigrant. So, which refers to all the people who are mostly political refugees, or also some economic refugees, of course, who just passed through the country and want to get into England. Those are now getting their own special category, and they're called transmigrants. And there is a lot of talk about that, and it's also a recent invention, in fact.
So may I infer from this your explanation that in order to control the discourse, you keep on changing terms in the sense that they have, on the face they look something, but in effect they are something else. So for example, here we have some equivalent that I found here. So we used to have a salesman. Now the salesman is being replaced, because I think over a period of time it has acquired negative connotation, and now I see that getting replaced as sales host, whereas in effect they are doing the same job, the same treatment is being meted out, but probably it's the name that so it's a process to, I mean, it is used to obscure the thing, like in the discourse.
Well, it is I think it's a very common process, you know, so to try and avoid pejorative meanings, and of course it never works in the long run, but and that's why it has to keep changing. Yes.
In terms of presupposition and entailment, there's a presupposition that an autochthonous population exists on the part of the autochthonous with respect. So both these populations exist.
Yeah.
It's a strong existential presupposition which may be false.
Yes.
So, in fact, it could well be probably yes.
But
there are no such populations at all.
No.
So that's actually what from using presupposition to tell a lie.
Yeah.
Because there's an existential presupposition, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. If you start looking at further details of this, it's full of these kinds of things. This is definitely a case of existential presupposition. She takes those categories for granted, because it's a she who's speaking here. She takes these categories simply for granted.
And the but today.
Yeah.
So there's a history, so that 1, 2, 3 is a history.
Yes.
And today is the present.
Yes.
It's beautiful. Thank you, Jef. We get this a lot, and this is very nice.
Yeah, so it's
but
well.
Today.
Yeah.
So in the past.
Yeah.
Today, very nice.
Okay. So another aspect of this anti-discourse that I'm talking about is something that you're probably very familiar with if you look at what is happening in the world today. So the unadaptedness or unadaptability of Islam is something that's very commonly stressed in the discourse. So there is generalized suspicion against anything that is Islamic. You get forms of enlightened condescension, like okay, there is people have problems with women wearing headscarves, and then they say that this is because they are against the wearing of headscarves for the sake of those women. So they don't even think about their own position and their own thinking about that. Now, it's still a form of enlightened condescension that you get there. But okay, that's too much to go into. Let's get to the second tool that is involved in this discursive change. The second tool is a form of utopic discourse. In contrast to the anti-discourse, there is a utopic discourse as well, which is for the shaping of the ideal society, right? Now, and one very important aspect of that is a whole lot of talk about national identity, which you find in numerous European countries at this moment. I have no idea what this is like in a country like India, but in many European countries, talk about, well, ideas about the need for a national identity. Well, they are behind a lot of the discourse that leads to the victory, well, the strong position of Le Pen in France, or well, the name won't tell you anything. There is a Dutch guy called Wilders, and his position in the Netherlands, which is very, very great extremist, very radical anti-Islamist, and so on. And he is very successful. It leads to the success of the rightist party in Austria. It leads to the success of Orban in Hungary. It leads to the success of Flemish nationalism in Belgium. It leads to the position of the true Finns in Finland. That discourse is all behind. It's also to a large extent behind the Brexit in the UK. But the story is never a completely simple story, of course, because it's always mixed with a lot of other things. Like, for instance, in the Flemish case, Flemish nationalism, the strongest Flemish nationalist party, which is the biggest Belgian political party at this moment, so their nationalism and their emphasis on national identity is combined at the same time with a strongly neo-liberal position in economic terms. And in the same way, some of the Brexit votes in England were also based on a form of leftist opposition against an undemocratic quality of the EU, which is definitely there, and you can understand that there is some resentment against some of the processes that take place in the European Union. So it's always a very mixed story, but what you get is this discourse that emphasizes national identity. And I give here very cryptic thing on the blackboard, which won't mean anything to you. Well, these are abbreviations of political parties in Belgium, a couple of them. And why do I put this here? Well, there are a couple of changes of names have taken place recently. So this is the abbreviation, who used to be the abbreviation for the Christian Democratic Party. They changed their name to what is the abbreviation of literally Christian Democratic, adjectives, Christian Democratic and Flemish. The V stands for Vlaams and Flemish. That is the name of the political party, Christian Democratic and Flemish. Adjectives, nothing like that. Then the other is the Liberal Party, which used to be literally translated the Party for Freedom and Progress. It changed its name to the Flemish Liberal Democrats. Flemish comes in. And then a bit later, in order to expand, they call themselves the Open Flemish Liberal Democrats. And then there is this, which is the biggest party at this moment, the New Flemish Alliance, Flemish again. Now, the interesting thing about this is that there is this felt need to get this linguistic ethnic identification, which apparently they didn't feel the need for 20, 30 years ago. But now, all of a sudden, they feel this need. Well, this is totally in line with this tendency to emphasize issues of national identity. And if you look at this in Gricean terms, then, okay, this shift towards an incorporation of the literal reference to Flemish, it is totally redundant, because in this country that I was talking about, with its fixed language border, there isn't, well, there is one, but very marginal, but there isn't any major political party that is active in both parts of the country. So they are all either Flemish or Walloon, French-speaking. So the political landscape is totally split up. So in Gricean terms, why do you then add this adjective Flemish? Well, it's totally redundant. Huh? Well, that means that there is extra meaning involved, right? That's right. The quantity maxim is totally violated. So there must be something else going on, and the something else that's going on, that is this felt need for the emphasis on a linguistic ethnic identity, and that in a context in which at the same time growing diversity is being emphasized. Now, how are all those people who do not have an affinity with this linguistic ethnic identity as such, how are they going to feel about their being represented on a political scale? It's an interesting phenomenon. Okay, but that's anecdotal, basically. Yeah.
Why do you choose to put parentheses around that?
I put the parentheses there because that's a recent addition. So now the party is called, without the parentheses, open. Around. Okay. I put the parentheses around national there because, well, to leave open the issue of whether or not you want to think about identity in terms of a nation state or not. In the case of Belgium, where we have a thoroughly split society, it is split on just about every level. We have, I forget how many governments. I think we have. Well, we still have a federal government that covers the whole. But then we have 3 governments for the 3 language communities, and we have 3 governments for 3 different regions, because the language communities do not entirely overlap with regions, because, for instance, Brussels is bilingual, and in the French-speaking part of the country there is also a pocket of speakers of German. So we have 3 plus 3, 7 governments, okay? So totally fragmented. And so in that kind of context, I wouldn't talk about national identity as such, except that I still want it to be there, because at the same time, on the side of the Flemish part of the country, for instance, there is also a tendency to strive towards as much independence as possible. And this one party, the biggest one actually, has as one of its major program points, in fact, an independent Flemish state. You know, so that's the reason for the brackets. Okay, it's because the situation can be complicated. Yes. Then, well, if you think about this issue of national identity in the context of diversity and migration issues, then, well, there are some very interesting things that you can read these days. Like, for instance, I'm giving a quote here from Paul Collier, who is a British, I don't know whether he's a sociologist, really. He presents himself as an expert on migration and things like that. And he himself has a German immigrant background. So his parents actually left Germany for the UK before the Second World War. So in fact, he is the product of immigration, and therefore he also presents himself as, of course, being totally open to in fact, very favorably inclined towards immigration, because he's one of them. But then if you look at what he writes, so you see, okay, I quote this: people in all societies manage mutual regard for their families, and usually also for their local communities. But the distinctive feature of the high-income societies is that mutual regard embraces a much larger group of people, namely fellow citizens. Thus, for example, the French are more willing to cooperate with each other and to make transfers to other citizens than are Nigerians. Strong statement. And this supports a range of institutions and norms that have enabled France to become much richer and more equal than Nigeria. Such differences in mutual regard are not genetic. In the distant past, France used to be like Nigeria, but France has benefited from a succession of intellectual revolutions that have gradually reconfigured how people perceive each other. Now, there is a lot going on in a quote like that. So basically it comes down to, well, in fact, it is part of a plea against too much migration. He positions himself as in favor of migration, but it has to be extremely well regulated. And why does it have to be well regulated? Because some people cannot be fitted into the mainstream society that we belong to, okay? And then there are a whole lot of other things that are involved here. Poverty, to a certain extent, is presented as people's own fault. Lack of willingness to cooperate. There is an evolutionist perspective there, so almost a denial of the coevalness of Nigeria and the UK in this case. There is also a disregard, total disregard for the material side of history, because France's riches is not simply the result of intellectual revolutions. It is as much a result of things that we have already been talking about, like colonization, for instance. But then at the same time, when you then get a review of this book in a Flemish paper, then the review gets this kind of title: Migration Without Taboos. And again, it's totally part, again, of this new normal which has developed, where you attack everything that can be blamed for political correctness, because politically correct discourse avoids the truth. They have too many taboos. So here, that's why I get this title. This is a book about migration, and it's a book without taboos. At least he's not afraid to tell the truth, right? That's the position that this represents. Now, there are lots of other things that I could give as examples, and I'm skipping some, but then I'm coming to language. So part of the utopic discourse is also an emphasis on the need for monolingualism. There is a very strong belief within the Flemish part of Belgian society that, in fact, everybody should be speaking the same language, otherwise we get a dysfunctional society. This in contrast to the reality of very widespread multilingualism, of course. A multilingualism which is of an everyday kind. In 1 out of 6 families in the Flemish part of the country, another language is used than Flemish. That's not a small minority, 1 in 6. It's still a minority, but it's not small. And in the big cities, this goes up to, well, 50% or so. So half the population in the bigger cities speaks another language at home. There is also widespread multilingualism of an elite kind, but then nothing negative will ever be said about that. So as long as the other language that's spoken is English, or preferably not French, but if it's English, for instance, or Spanish would be wonderful too, that's all perfect. But it cannot be the languages of the real social minorities. So it cannot be Arabic, or it cannot be Turkish or something like that. No, that's not so acceptable. And then this translates into, well, and again, all this happens in spite of the fact that in everyday life you find mixtures all the time. So what I'm projecting here is a little sign at a small event in a shopping center where piñatas, which are these Mexican things that are filled with candy, and which at a birthday party, for instance, have to be smashed by children to get the candy out. Okay, piñatas were not known in Belgium until they were introduced probably not more than 10 years ago, but the concept is there now, the word is there, and smash is not a Dutch word. No, but here the sign there, smash the piñata and choose a present. And cadeau is a French word. So you get a mixture there of English, Dutch, Spanish, and French in just this one little sentence. So the mixture is there all the time. This is maybe an extreme example, but you find that sort of mixture all the time. That's the reality. But still there is this ideology according to which the society cannot be fully functional if there isn't a full command for everybody of one specific common language. And this translates into policy. Like, for instance, what I'm quoting here comes from an administrative agreement between the political parties that govern my city, Antwerp. And they have been in government from 2013 to 2018, and unfortunately they will be in government for the next 6 years also. In a section on their common agreement that is labeled Living in the City, one of the things that it says there is the social housing authorities get the means to further develop and test the Dutch proficiency of the inhabitants. Language is the key to integration, and the ability to express oneself in Dutch can prevent quite some problems of livability. Whoever refuses to learn Dutch will be sanctioned. Now, in actual practice, what this means is that somebody who is judged to be unwilling to learn adequate Dutch, that they can be refused access to social housing. And this is regarded as common sense. This is not something that is regarded as what it should be regarded like, namely discrimination. Because if you think of the definition of discrimination, it means that you use specific resources for specific groups of people, not in function of their needs, but in function of who they are, right? So not in function of what the means, the resources are for, but simply on the basis of other characteristics, in this case, their ability to speak the local language. So access to social housing, and this was of course challenged. This was brought to the courts, but the courts decided this was perfectly okay. But we have anti-discrimination laws, and still the courts decide this is okay, right? So that's how far as the influence of this type of ideology really goes. Now, in spite of the fact that all of this, of course, is based on three totally false premises. So the false premises being, first of all, that without forcing them, they won't learn. If you force them, they will learn. And if everybody speaks the same language, quote unquote, there are no communication problems anymore. All three of them are false premises, right? And inability can very easily be translated into unwillingness in the judgment of the officials who are in charge of handling these sorts of affairs. Now, I could go on with examples like that, but I will just skip some because that will take too long. I will just get to an interesting quote, which comes from a different level. Namely, this is from a language policy document that was issued by a former Minister of Education. So this is still from a former Minister of Education, but I can tell you the present Minister of Education adheres to this, to the letter. And I just quote from this Minister of Education. In a society where linguistic communication seems to be subject to a process of fragmentation, so that's something I take out of the text. Now, what does that imply? That is a qualification of a state of affairs that only makes sense if you accept monolingualism as a norm. It doesn't make sense to start talking about fragmentation unless you take as a norm unity, right? And at the same time, this is also based on an idea of language as a natural entity. So there is a lot of language ideology involved there, seeing language as a natural entity, a monolithic unity that has an identifiable life of its own, as a real thing, right? Now, then the second thing I quote there, specifically for the Flemish context, the Dutch language, and here, okay, I just repeat, Flemish and Dutch, it's interchangeable there. We call the language that we speak Dutch for the reasons that I gave. Specifically for the Flemish context, the Dutch language is an important aspect of Flemish identity. Yes, that touches the core of the problem, of course. It manifests a way of thinking in terms of Flemish, and whether you would want to call it national or not, Flemish identity, which is defined in ethnic linguistic terms. That is, so the Minister of Education accepts that definition for the society he is supposed to serve, okay? And the third part that I'm quoting there, the Dutch language is, as a relatively small language community, vulnerable to an environment where, through the media, the economy, and international communication, other and more dominant languages penetrate the life world and play an important role. Now, what he's referring to there, of course, is something totally different. So here he refers to elite languages that also penetrate the society. Of course, there is more and more usage that's being made of international languages, such as English, for instance. So the problem with this statement is that the part of the motivation for this emphasis on a monolingual character as a necessary property of the society to function properly, this is also positioned against the background of a threat to the language. And historically, of course, and as the history you're referring to, historically, Flemish has felt under the threat of French, and for a long period of time there were good reasons for that, because indeed there was an attempt to make Belgium into a monolingual French-speaking country, so there were good reasons for that. But at this very moment, Dutch is not under threat in any kind of way. If you simply look at the number of speakers, so there are more than 20 million speakers of Dutch, in spite of the fact that 20 million, when you look at that on a scale of a subcontinent like India, doesn't mean anything, still, in the range of the languages in the world, it still figures in the top 50 or 60 of those 6,000 languages that are there, right? It is still one of the 50 or 60 most spoken languages in the world. It is, there are more speakers of Dutch than there are speakers of all Scandinavian languages together, for instance, okay? But still there is this total misconception about the position of the language as such. So there is this fear that is brought in as part of an argument for developing the policies that are to be found. Okay, there is okay. Well, yeah, let me. Well, yeah, this is also very relevant. Again, from the same document from the same Minister of Education. The first thing that I'm quoting there says, an active language policy in education consists in stimulating the high-quality use of Dutch in combination with proficiency in foreign languages. The two go together. Without solid and rich knowledge of and practice in the mother tongue, one does not achieve rich usage of foreign languages. Now, at first sight, in itself, there is nothing wrong with it. The only problem is that what this is applied to is only proficiency in foreign languages that are the elite languages. It is important for people to learn, for Flemish people to learn some French, and it's important for them to learn maybe some German, though that's becoming marginal. But English, definitely, they have to learn that. But then the second part of that quote, which emphasizes the need to take care of the mother tongue, the home language, that emphasis seems to be applied only to the majority population that speaks Dutch at home. It is never applied in policy that would be set out to promote language maintenance for instance, speakers of Turkish or speakers of Arabic. No, that would be totally discouraged. And then you get the second quote there, the bigger the gap between home language and school language, the bigger the risk for a child to develop language deficiency, and thus learning deficiency. And here you get something that then is applied only exclusively to those who speak languages such as Arabic or Turkish or Berber at home, and that would put them at a disadvantage in their school learning, in spite of the fact that just before that they've said, well, home languages are very important, we have to foster those because that makes it easier to acquire another language. No, those languages have to be basically eliminated. Elite foreign languages, that's fine, but all those local foreign languages, no, they are a nuisance. And then the final thing in this context that I want to mention briefly is that then this is relatively anecdotal but very significant. So relatively recently, there were some schools in the Brussels area that announced the initiative to start teaching Arabic outside of regular class hours. But then, against the background of this language ideology, which discourages the use of Arabic, for instance, this would have to be justified. Now, how was it justified? The official justification that was launched was the following, namely, it was justified by saying that this would keep youngsters of Arabic descent out of the Quran schools. That's the justification. And then you get so, well, here, of course, well, it is utopic discourse that meets the anti-discourse. It is the anti-Islamic movement that gets combined with the language ideology and so on. And I could go on to a lengthy analysis of some comments that a very well-meaning journalist wrote about this, just to show how much of the tension in all of this is even brought into the discourse of those who present themselves as being very open and very tolerant. Okay, that would take up the rest of the session, and then we don't have any time for anything else anymore. So let's stop here and see if there are any questions at this moment.
I mean, I can say it from here. I don't need that. You know, one of the issues, though, that I mean, is are the quotes run out justified yours? Because, you know, having first-hand experience from my own undergraduate who speaks Arabic at home, being from a family that came from Lebanon, and she speaks French because she came from Lebanon, and she speaks American English. But she wanted to learn her parents wanted to learn to write Arabic script, but she couldn't because the schools are so tightly tied, and they are, you know, they are scientists. They say they are not religious, but they're proud of their Arabic identity. So, I mean, that, I'm wondering who put the justified in there with the quotes, because that actually is more real than ideological. It can be used to justify your, you know, combining the two, anti-Islamization with whatever, with anti-migrant discourse. But, you know, it is actually a very real problem because of the issue of writing. Of the, you know, we're back on scripts again. Writing.
Yes.
So this is an under-thought out question, but you know, it's often said, or I'm formulating it that way, that natural languages are notoriously undemocratic in the same way that wealth, capital is undemocratic, in the sense that I think the figures I read, which I think over-dramatized, is that 90% of the world's population speak 10% of the world's languages, and the other way around. That means there are lots of these 6,000 languages which very, very small populations speak. So, so the dominant languages, which include actually Hindi, and Bengali and Spanish and English and Chinese, dominate the linguistic landscape, and there is a battle at the top for China to take over from English as the dominant language, but the rest of the tail, the long tail of the world's languages are spoken by very small populations, and the migration, if you like, tends to be towards these powerful languages. This follows capital. So again, you could say that capital bunches at the top, and then the rest of the world's population live on small incomes, and 10% have very large incomes and own land as well as money. banking. So now the question is that if there is this tendency among populations to migrate towards power, and there is a language ideology which says, you know, languages are essentially syntactically equal, semantically equal, all of them can expand gloriously, all of them have similar linguistic properties, okay, which linguists believe as a shibboleth. But on the ground, we see this sort of, I would say, not democratic processes.
Sure.
What ideological positions do we take in countries like India, where we are always saying the indigenous or autochthonous, you know, they're fading slowly because there is no capital to be generated within those languages. So what would be your position? I don't know whether this takes you far afield, but these are facts in the sense of presented as facts and probably are facts. How do we think about these issues of linguistic democracy?
Yes, that's an extremely difficult issue, and I certainly cannot say anything about India. But the general position would be to say, well, languages inevitably, just like languages change, languages also die. So, and if you have very small language communities which do not maintain themselves as communities, and where, for instance, young people all leave and go and live somewhere else, then those languages are going to disappear. Yes. But so language, you cannot. I don't think you can regard language as languages as species, right? Languages are basic tools for maintaining societies and social interaction. And even though, as linguists, we think it's a pity if a language disappears, yes, it is a pity, but at the same time, under certain circumstances, it is just going to happen. And as long as the people who are involved, the last surviving people are going to feel very disadvantaged, I'm afraid. Yes, and there is something very undemocratic going on there.
That's right.
Definitely.
And it's very important for us because we are linguists suggesting policy positions on this. Now, if we're realistic, then it's realistic to say a lot of the languages will die as we know them, but these 10 competing languages, then obviously the next step is to say they'll start breaking again at the edges, and this is a kind of cyclic process. We don't really know.
No.
But I think it's really important for us in terms of the positions, liberal positions we take unthinkingly, say that we need to preserve X or Y languages. How do we think about language death, language survival? For us, this is a real question because we have 1/6 of it. Maybe it's not for everybody in this world, but is it for you an important question at all?
Yeah. So I think So the most sane position you can take there is probably to say as soon as there is a felt need within a specific language community to maintain their language, everything should be done that's possible to maintain it. And of course, in the contexts that I'm talking about are very different in the sense that what we are dealing with in a country like Belgium is not small minorities in which it is not possible to maintain the community languages, because they're absolutely numerous enough and there are sufficient resources to provide the schooling, also to get the writing, the writing schooling done. Yes, absolutely, and that's yes, but that is possible.
And that to absorb the universal literature in Arabic,
Yeah.
which is
Yes.
one of the world's major languages.
Absolutely, and it is possible to do that, but nothing of that sort is happening in a country like Belgium.
That's
There is
why
no.
tying the Arabic language to Quranic schools is not, is a discriminatory thing.
Yeah.
There is a vast literature in Arabic which is not associated with religious practice.
Yes, but here the justification that I'm referring to there, the justification is not to keep them away from Quran schools because they would be learning Arabic there. No, but because of their training in Islam.
Yes, exactly. That's why if you're a non-religious person, you would prefer to learn your Arabic.
Of course, yes. And it's not happening. Yes.
Can I get like 10 seconds?
Sure.
Someone wants to.
Anybody wants to speak up? Sure. Please. No, I meant off.
Yeah, so I just, when you're talking about utopic discourse, it seems like, the sort of utopian idea is nation, in a sense, right? Yeah. But I see there's another thing at work, I think, I'm not as familiar as you live there, but about Europeanness, or EU as like a compact of different a certain kind of multilingual compact that is going beyond nation, is sort of trying to introduce multilingualism as a marker of citizenship, of European citizenship, which seems also to be a utopian marker. But then it seems like this rise of right-wing populism and linguistic nationalism is coming at a time as the European project becomes more embedded. And so we're getting an idea of like European, what it seems to be also a factor here is European versus non-European in the exclusion and idea of multilingualism. And so this thing you're presenting is also sort of questioning the idea of Europe itself, it seems to me, as this, as this continual kind of almost colonial project, with the EU, which, EU won Nobel Peace Prize for this kind of thing, right? But it seems like this is sort of what's happening, and right-wing populism is kind of coming in this context too. I don't know.
Yes, and given the context of the European Union, it is really absolutely a distinction between what's European and what's non-European that is very often at stake. And this happens not only at the level of language, but also at the level of religion. Because actually Europeanness, very often these days, well, Europeanness is only used if it suits the political purposes, And one context in which it suits the political purposes is in this opposition to migration. And one of the basic claims in an anti-migration movement would be we have to preserve our European values, which are Christian values. So Islam does not really fit in there. It's Christian values. And then Christianity is referred to in spite of the fact that practicing Christians, they are a very small minority, right? So Christianity is becoming something very abstract in terms of some sort of cultural heritage that you have. You have to preserve those churches and things like that. The buildings are not to be touched. It is a pity if a Christian building would be taken over for a mosque or something like that, even though many churches are not being used and could easily be used by other religions and so on. It sometimes happens. I know of a church in Antwerp that is now being used by Orthodox Christians, so Russians, That is still felt to be acceptable, but if it goes beyond that, it's breaking the common values that we are all supposed to share. So at that level, yes, Europeanness comes in as sometimes very, I don't know how to describe it, very counterproductive or treacherous sort of argument, right?
Yeah, because it seems like then Flemish, like when they're saying, oh, Flemish, you know, as this sort of national identity, but it seems like, you know, you're saying these things are relatively recent, and these happen within Europe, like within the time that Belgium is part of European Union. So it seems like this this European Union might have kind of produced on the local level some ideas of values of a certain kind or something like this.
No, I don't think it is caused by the existence of the European Union. So the fight for a local identity is something that, as also Jenny pointed out, it has been going on for centuries, you know. So that really predates the the European Union.
But has it turned into this populism of the kind you are discussing, and it's all over.
Yeah, but that populism, as you say, it's all over. It's not restricted to Europe. You find it in many other places as well at the moment. There is something going on there at that level of the public sphere that is really shared internationally.
You know, it's sort of also, it's anti-cosmopolitanism. You know, there was the idea that you can have a multilingual identity, either, you know, I mean, for something at the end of the 19th century, which reasserted itself with the nation building at the end in the 19th century. There were peoples there, and there was one specific kind of person who was seen as outside the national framework and was a cosmopolitan. It was always used as a slur against those people, and it isn't used anymore. In fact, they're going to get a free pass. You can learn your classical Hebrew, you can learn your modern Hebrew, and you can speak Hebrew with Gujaratis in the diamond district, as I know, of Antwerp, where the largest diamond traders come from Gujarat now. They are not Jews. But they get a free pass, but they have a language that no one's going to touch because they control. You were talking, I think, about social capital and cultural capital, but they also have a different kind of capital. But it's this anti-cosmopolitan.
Yeah.
It is extraordinary that it's coming to America at this time. It is quite remarkable.
My point is, whatever culture and religion and ideology is there in the world, but what should be the basic motto of pragmatic discourse analysis?
Well, actually, we have to get down to that now. So let me, yeah. So yes, oh, you wanted to ask a question? Yes.
I just have a comment.
About
the discussion we were having right now. So, I mean, it's very, very briefly. So, I'll just give an anecdote, which is that in my class, I asked my students, how many of you, there were 60, 65 students sitting in front of me, how many of you can write your, your alphabet in your mother tongue? And okay, and I asked that question, and no one raised their hand. Okay, and they were speaking all Gujarati, Marathi, Hindi, whatever. No one raised their hand. So I said, "Are you ashamed of yourself?" Surprisingly, no one said yes.
Wow.
So this anecdote speaks volumes for where we are today. So the situation is completely different.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Thank you for the comment. Yes. Okay, but since the question is coming up of how do we go about analyzing discourse from a pragmatic point of view, yes, we haven't said that much about it yet. I've hinted at a number of very general principles so far. But let's just go to a little example. I have to skip a whole bunch of stuff that I had sitting here. And the example is a text which is coming from the corpus that I refer to in Ideology and Language Use, and you can find it back in the book, so there is no need to even write down anything. And maybe what I'm going to say will be already obvious to those of you who have read it, but I'm sure that not everybody has had a chance to do so. Okay, so what I have here is a little account of the so-called Indian Mutiny, which appeared in one specific English, British history textbook. And I'll just read quickly for you, because this may not be totally clear. Okay, causes of the Indian Mutiny, 1857. One reason why the Second Chinese War dragged on so long was the preoccupation of British forces in India. There, Dalhousie's annexations had caused considerable anxiety and vexation among the native princes. Recent land settlements had annoyed the larger landowners, especially in Aude, by favoring the actual cultivators of the soil. And religious prejudices had been offended by the equipment of the native sepoys with rifles which required greased cartridges. Those who cherished these and other grievances thought that they had a good opportunity for vengeance in the fact that the British troops in India were few and scattered. The discontent was most widespread in the native regiments of the northwest provinces, and in May 1857, some of them stationed at Meerut broke out in open mutiny, shot their officers, and stirred up similar mutinies in the neighboring camps. Bengal and the greater part of the Madras and Bombay presidencies kept quiet. And the Sikhs of the Punjab had been so well used by Sir John Lawrence that they helped the British. The main incidents in the struggle were the massacre of Cawnpore and the sieges of Delhi and Lucknow. The Europeans at Cawnpore surrendered in June after a month's siege and were butchered. At Delhi, where a descendant of the Mughals had been set up as emperor, the mutineers themselves were besieged from May to September by troops from the Punjab under John Nicholson, and so on and so forth. Just some more incidents are enumerated there. Now, a first thing to keep in mind if you start analyzing a text is something for which you will find a specific guideline in the book, which says that you have to make sure that you understand the type of discourse, the activity type, basically, that the discourse represents before you draw any specific conclusions from the forms that you see. And for instance, if you're, some of you have read up on critical discourse analysis, and in critical discourse analysis, for instance, you will find a statement that if you find an abundance of passives in a text, this is an attempt to take away the attention from agentivity. The same will be said about an abundance of nominalizations, which put together complex states of affairs into a condensed nominal structure. Again, this will be presented as an example of something that, that indicates that responsibility is somehow being evaded. Now, it would be very dangerous and in violation of some basic pragmatic principles to just go to a text, observe these forms, passives and nominalizations, for instance, and then conclude, aha, this author is really trying to de-emphasize agentivity and to avoid the identification of responsibility and things like that. Because different activity types, different types of text, for instance, have their own conventions. So the term activity type may not be fully familiar with all of you, but it is a very essential notion here. Like, for instance, an activity type would be a job interview. And there are these very interesting early studies, for instance, by John Gumpertz, of studies of a job interview that takes place in England with some people with obviously autochthonous British backgrounds, and then somebody applying for a job who has for instance, a Pakistani background or whatever. And you get an interaction there which you expect to conform to some general norms that are attached to the activity type of a job interview. And what are those norms? Well, some of those norms are, for instance, that you try to present yourself in as favorable a manner as possible, display your capacities, make sure that the other side, which is the side that is in power and that can give you a job or not give you a job, that they get convinced of your capacities. So you have to display yourself in the most favorable light you can imagine. But at the same time, there is also the rule that you cannot be lying there. You have to be honest, and honesty is also appreciated. Only there are some types of honesty that are not appreciated in that kind of context. For instance, the job interview that John analyzed that I'm thinking of, there somebody is applying for a job in the library of a college, and the interviewers ask at a certain moment, why are you interested in this particular job? Now, the expectation is that then you start to enumerate all kinds of qualities that you know about the place where you want to work and why it's so interesting to work there. But the response of the interviewee is a very honest one. He says, well, I've applied for 80 jobs already, and I just need a job, right? Now, that violates...
He says, I'm not interested in that particular job.
Yes.
I am interested in any job.
Yes.
And there is the rhythm in which he says
yes.
and the way of...
And so this violates... This violates the expectation of this specific activity type that you have there. Now, in the same way, so if you then think about this text as part of a history textbook, well, this is part of academic writing, and in academic writing, well, sometimes people are even taught that it is quite useful to use passives, that you can use very condensed structures, especially if your space is limited. So you go on to use lots of nominalization constructions and so on. And that's exactly what is happening in this text. So for instance, if you look at all the verb phrases, about half of them are passive. Half of them are passives. And if you look at nominalizations, yeah, there are quite a few condensations of very complex states of affairs there. So here, jumping to a conclusion that you might jump to if you want to believe in fixed form function relationships, it gets you on the wrong track. You have to keep the specific properties of the activity type really in mind in order to get into an analysis. Now, then at the same time, there are some interesting things that you can observe when, for instance, an expectation would somehow be violated. So, and in this text, for instance, well, you expect of a academic piece of writing that it is rationally built up, that it only uses rational arguments and things like that, that there is not too much reference to vague things such as emotions that would be involved. And to a certain extent, well, yes, you find that this expectation is met by this text. Like, okay, this talks about the causes of, this is analytical. So one reason why, so there is an analysis of state of affairs caused by, and so on. But then there are also things that, given your expectations for this type of text, somehow violate those expectations, because there is a lot of reference to things that have to do with personal reactions and emotions. Like, okay, I list them there: anxiety and vexation, so had annoyed, religious prejudices, had been offended, they cherished grievances, vengeance comes in, discontent comes in. And then when you get that sort of violation of a pattern of expectation, then this becomes extremely interesting when you can find a pattern there. And so what is the pattern that you find there? So it's probably too obvious for you to mention, you know. So the pattern that you find there is that all these emotions are ascribed only to Indians. They're only ascribed to Indians, which means those Indians in the revolt, they were simply involved emotionally, and this means that by contrast, the British who were involved there, they were involved professionally as soldiers. They were just doing their job, right? They are not out for vengeance. No, they don't cherish any grievances. No, that's all. That's the Indian's job, right? So this immediately frames the events in a very specific way, with the British involved in a specific way, the Indians in a totally different way, with, of course, lots of values attached to that. So where the professionality that is suggested for the British side is, of course, the kind of thing that would be praised. There is courage that can be referred to. So when you talk about a handful of British troops who held the ill-fortified residency, this indicates courage. You can refer to these kinds of qualities, but you cannot refer to emotional involvement of any sort. They're just doing their job, right? You wanted to say something about that?
I just want to say that, if you look at assimilation or the nominalization, and we said withdrawal of agency is normally indicated, but not in this case. But actually, I was just wondering whether authority or a kind of distance or dispassion is also a mark of removal. Because in a lot of colonial texts, you find the idea that you are masterfully distanced from the local population. And this is an attitude of removal from trauma. So it is a superior stance.
Yes,
it is a
definitely.
Stance. And so it's an authoritative, the protection of authority because you're not involved.
Yes.
I call indifference, but
Absolutely.
in some sense,
Yeah.
there is still the idea that you're agentedly withdrawn, these are the facts presented, and you have to act dispassionately.
Absolutely. Yes.
Maybe you could interpret it again within the more text.
Yes.
Relating to the same figure, you would see textual patterns of phalanx of text, which again show very similar.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And then indeed, as you say, this becomes really interesting if you can find this pattern reoccurring in a number of different occasions. And there may, of course, be certain instances that you find which then again contradict this, and then you have to look for an explanation for that as well. But okay, these kinds of patterns become very interesting. Another kind of pattern that you yes.
So we have been saying that a particular kind of discourse is being disseminated by the people in authority because they are justifying themselves. Like it is a British text, so they are, presenting it in a way that ideologically we know on a subtle level they are saying that they are correct, they are logical, they are, rational, whereas Indians are not. But how do we know that Indians or the readers are perceiving it in that way? How do we know that the audience, the target readers, they are being influenced? Do we have any evidence of that? How can we simply say it is? It can be just an interpretation of ours.
Well, that's a very interesting question that you're asking there. So, getting hold of the interpretations, well, for that, of course, you need to be able to study the interpretations of the interpreters, right? And you don't have access to them. But in a case like this, where you see that you get a textbook, which is obviously going to have some sort of authority, and if this textbook shows patterns that are very similar to other types of texts that emerge in the same period, then once you see that a specific pattern of interpretation, well, a specific frame of interpretation of events is widespread through a number of different sources, and that this is a pattern that seems to dominate, then you can also be pretty sure that this is the common way of interpreting things.
So intertextuality becomes a kind of an evidence in this case.
So the evidence in this case is purely intertextual. So the evidence in this case is purely intertextual.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's intertextual if you look across text, but it's not intersubjective.
No.
Because you don't have the readers before the.
Okay.
Yeah.
How they are interacting with the text. Okay, yes.
You don't have that part.
No.
And secondly, the interpretation is happening in the brain, and we don't know how the brain is functioning. It's just our interpretation. So we can have only the external resources as an evidence.
And that is again, and I want to come back to what I was talking about yesterday. That is a good reason why it makes sense to talk about meaning potential when you're analyzing language, because on many occasions you do not have access to the actual effects, right? So, but in that case, it still makes sense to talk about the meaning potential that a text has. And especially when then you get widespread patterns, you do have something, right?
One tag question to what you have just responded. Is it completely foolish to ask, to conduct a kind of an interview or a survey to ask what their interpretation was? Like, is it completely, will it always be off the mark? Or?
You can, no, on some occasions you can do reception research, of course. If you're dealing with current, present-day texts, for instance, you can get a number of people together, for instance, in focus groups to let them talk about this. And then that will teach you something about their way of interpreting what the text says. Or you can even do interviews, yes, but with interviews you have to be extremely careful, of course, because you can never take the answer to a question for granted, no? Because you would need to know exactly how your question is being interpreted by the person that you're talking to. And since everybody comes from different backgrounds, that's very difficult to control as well. So for that kind of thing, things like what was Janola mentioned, focus groups would probably be more efficient ways of trying to get to the interpretation that is likely to emerge from a specific text with a specific meaning potential. Yeah.
I want to say that in post-colonial theory, people looked at the British archive and read it against the grain, borrowing methods from deconstruction, and that was one of the reasons why the Indian Mutiny was actually renamed the First War of Indian Independence. So you do have specific linguistic changes from a historical readership because they're reading the same text, but they're reading it in a different way between the lines. So historians are like a focus group for this sort of text, and it has led to extensive rewriting and renaming. So that is one way to look at the idea of leadership across time. Certain post-colonial theory suggests renaming and reconfiguring of the logic of the text. So that's another sort of methodology on offer for historians who have redone the text.
Yes.
So could you please elaborate upon the concepts of context and co-text?
Well, if I make a distinction, then I use co-text only for the directly surrounding text. And context is everything outside of that. But co-text is also context. Context is the more general term. No. So co-text for me would be the directly surrounding text.
So that's the collocation. That's the collocation of the, it's around the object.
So if in the text that we have been analyzing here, this Mutiny 1, if we see the co-text, so the co-text is emphasizing that alright, that Indians were emotionally charged and the Britishers were logical. But if we say the context, we know that it depends on from where the text is coming.
Yes, very important point, which I also wanted to make, namely, when you go into an analysis like this, there is a whole lot of contextual information that you need. So there are some aspects of this text, for instance, which you can impossibly interpret without a lot of contextual background knowledge. Like, for instance, let me go back to the text itself. So, for instance, where you have where is it? Okay, so for instance, where it says the native sepoys who were then equipped with rifles which required greased cartridges. Now, what the hell does that mean? If you don't have any more background information about this, so you have to know this whole background of the stories that were there about, well, of course, the factuality of different rifles that were introduced, which did require cartridges, the tip of which had to be bitten off, and the cartridges themselves were somehow greased with cow fat or pig fat. And of course, both for the Hindus and for Muslims, this was totally unacceptable. So, and then this was the story that was supposed to be triggering the revolt. But this is background information, so none of that is even remotely mentioned here in this text. This is simply regarded as common knowledge in the heads of the readers of this textbook. And then there are other things which are even harder to understand. Like, for instance, and the Sikhs of the Punjab had been so well used by Sir John Lawrence that they helped the British. Now, what the hell can that mean? Now, so there is no way in which you can make sense of that without a whole lot of contextual knowledge that is totally outside of this text. And that's why I mentioned yesterday also this example of the polar bear, right? So that outside contextual knowledge is not your object of investigation, but you need it, right? It's not what you're investigating when you're investigating this text, but you need it in order to be able to understand what's happening there. Yes.
Can we say that it is discourse analysis which makes use of context, and when we do critical discourse analysis, we need a context?
Oh,
Can we differentiate it like that?
I don't make those distinctions. No. So critical discourse analysis.
In this text, if we have to make a distinction between discourse analysis and CDA, how
No,
do we
I
do
would
that?
I would say any good form of discourse analysis has to take context into account. Any decent form of discourse analysis, unless you get a form.
CDA only. In that case, it becomes CDA only when you are beginning to explain anything with complete context, very deeply, critically. It becomes critical discourse analysis.
Well, if that's what you want to call it. These labels are not so important, So certain traditions emerge. You have to think about the academic enterprise as a very human enterprise where certain things emerge naturally within groups of people, right?
The point being linguist, we are questioned what is the difference between discourse analysis and critical discourse analysis. So it is a kind of a responsibility that we should know that if we are using a term, then what is the distinction between these
Well,
terms?
anybody who forces you to give a completely definitive definition of a tradition such as critical discourse analysis should be chided. Yes.
But I'm just wondering, one from BA to is there a point where we can say that now we are moving from BA to CDA?
Excuse me?
Is there any point when we can say that now we are moving from BA to CDA?
Well,
but you see, this text is different from the other text that you gave us before, in that this is a historical document, and we touched on yesterday, the whole issue
of stylistics. The example you gave was a lovely example, and it makes, I was sitting here sort of dreaming through and thinking, yeah, it's like, if you put up a text from a Shakespeare play, had been so well used, that is the kind of historical, stylistic construction that you would never get now, and it wouldn't make any sense for most people. So I was just wondering, is there a danger in demonstrating discourse analysis and language ideology with a historical text that most of us here are going to have a very different take on, and we don't even know, other than, I think you said it was a textbook, where it came from. And at the very time it was written, which of course historically we're not going to have time to go into or look at, but there was this issue of, people would have taken issue with the way the thing was phrased, the way the thing was written, whose language, to whom was it addressed, for what schools, for what purpose. Actually, if you want to do history on it, did the kids get examined on this, the children, the students? So there's a lot of things. It's a class document to start with. We're so ill-used by Sir John Lawrence. Most working class children who worked the mills of the Midlands, they wouldn't have known that construction. And it is, and all the men in the British Army who fought on one side, on the other side, so to speak, they would have had a very different view, and they had a different view of this text. So I do think you have to be a bit careful with historical text as a demonstration.
Yes, you have to be careful, but the important point here is that this is a sentence which also, for the people in those days being used to this form of expression, it still leaves everything implicit that this refers to. It's still totally implicit. It's totally vague. You don't know. You don't know. Yeah, you don't know what this refers to unless you know the history. And the history is that just only a decade earlier, the Punjab had been captured with the help of the same sepoys who were revolting in '57, and John Lawrence was probably a smart colonialist. So he first disarmed the Sikhs of the Punjab, then he gradually started rearming them, giving them favors. And then when this situation came up, it was a wonderful opportunity for Sikhs to take revenge and start looting Delhi and things like that. Now, so there is a whole lot of complex history behind this, which is left totally vague in this sentence. And that's the kind of contextual information that you need in order to be able to make sense of this. Yeah. But, okay, another question?
It's a query like, is the diversity of language, religion and culture creates problem for effective communication in the framework of pragmatic discourse analysis?
I don't understand the question.
So we know that there are variety of or different types of religion, culture and languages are there.
Yeah, yes.
Then is it creating some problem for the effective communication in the framework of pragmatic discourse analysis? If yes, then how is possible? And is the field of pragmatic discourse analysis a dustbin? And if not, then how misunderstanding is happening in the framework of discourse, pragmatic discourse analysis?
I still don't think I get the drift entirely of the question that you're asking. You seem to be asking about a relationship between ways of analyzing and the existence.
I understood that the main motto of pragmatic discourse analysis is to create effective communication. We should have effective communication. So, if
pragmatic analysis is not normative in the sense that we don't prescribe the way.
That means whatever we are discussing is it is not getting some sense, or we are not building any theory.
Well, we are analyzing data and trying to understand how discourse works. That's
then pragmatic discourse analysis is a dustbin. Everything can be entered into that. Everything we can.
Well, it is a dustbin in the sense that many different things fit in there. Many different things fit in there, but all of these different things can be made useful, right? So it's not as if you.
No, how can you sustain if it is not the case that today we are using, tomorrow it can root out? It should be sustained.
No. If you're analyzing, then you're supposed to be doing.
We should build a theory for that. Whatever we are discussing, that should have a theory.
Oh, you mean you need a theory in order to do good analysis?
You cannot say today. Okay, today you told this. Forget. Not like that. But changing is unchanging manner.
Okay, anyway.
That should have a root.
Just let's make this very practical and say, well, okay, the analysis or the elements of analysis that I'm presenting here now, I am pretty confident that I can give the same elements of analysis 20 years from now. So what I'm talking about is real linguistic phenomena that you can analyze. And I want to go on actually to a couple more examples that are related to this text, because we're not.
This one is so interesting.
Yeah, of course. So let me get to a couple of other elements of what is happening in this text, just to show, and these are elements that will remain in that text, you know. They will remain in that text, and they will remain equally relevant. It's not something that you just change tomorrow. Now, okay, here for instance, in terms of categorization. Categorization is another important phenomenon to look at when you look at texts. And you get categorization of people, you get categorization of events. And you see, well, in the categorization of people, I'm just listing the categories there. So British forces, the native princes, the larger landowners, the actual cultivators of the soil, which is an interesting one, because the actual cultivators of the soil, they contrast, of course, with those who are not actual cultivators, and this is brought in as a way of justifying the land reform measures that were taken. So a lot of other stuff going on there. The native sepoys, those who cherished the British troops, the native regiments, their officers, the Sikhs of the Punjab, Sir John Lawrence, the British, the Europeans, and a descendant of the Mughals, the mutineers, troops from the Punjab, John Nicholson, a handful of British troops, Sir Henry Lawrence, Sir Henry Havelock, Lord Clyde, so on. Now, what's the pattern that you see there? It's again too obvious, maybe, but what's the pattern that you see there in the way in which the agents involved are categorized?
You mean first naming the group and chunking the native principles
yeah.
and say, you know, this particular landowner and the Maharaja or Raja.
Yeah. Yes. And now, yes, actually, this is the most striking feature, that the only people who get names are the British. Now, one important methodological thing that I want to point out is, now please, also if you observe something like that, don't jump to conclusions. Because you could easily say, well, a personalization on the one hand means depersonalization on the other hand. So this is a depersonalization of the enemy. Now, it may be not as simple as that, because you can also use very specific personal names to demonize an enemy. Like, okay, just think about Osama bin Laden, for instance, whose name was known by everybody. Yeah? So, and the naming itself is also can come in as a demonizing element. Now here, the chunking together of the Indians in opposition to the individual British does not necessarily have to have that effect, because there are also other things can be involved. Like, for instance, elements of audience design. This is a book aimed for a British audience, and many of those British kids were probably familiar with a number of those names. There are, for instance, if you visit Trafalgar Square in London, then there is not only Nelson's statue, but there are a bunch of other statues, and one of those statues is of Sir Henry Havelock, so he was not an unknown figure. So this may be an element of audience design, but that's still not the end of the story, because why is it then that in the little fragment from a French textbook on the same episode, there is the naming of the leader of the revolt, namely, well, in the French it is Nana Sahib. I don't know whether that means anything, whether that's a real name that is known here. But Nana Sahib is mentioned in this French textbook. It's not mentioned in this English textbook. So why is it there for the French? Because for the French probably he was not better known than for the British. But then again, there are other things that come in. Like, for instance, in a couple of decades before that French textbook appeared, there was a novel by Jules Verne, a novel which played 10 years after the revolt, and it played in India. And actually, Nana Sahib was never captured, he was never found. So in that novel, Jules Verne makes good use of that to introduce Nana Sahib in the background as a threat in that novel, in which a bunch of British officers are making a hunting trip through northern India. so very, very colonial setting. Yeah? So there is a whole lot of different things that may be involved, and what I'm saying in this case is, now, don't jump to conclusions. You need to find pretty clear reoccurring patterns before you can start drawing conclusions. It's not on the basis of this single text that you could draw a conclusion here. So I wanted to mention this because methodologically it's so important to point out how careful you have to be with interpretations when you do a form of discourse analysis, and whether you want to call it a critical discourse analysis or not. Okay, so this means I didn't get to points 5 and 6 on in my table of contents when I started this morning, and with the 5 minutes that are left, I cannot go into that. So let's just open this for discussion. Whatever else needs to be discussed, we can do that now. So it's a pity I didn't get any further, because I got some interesting European Union stuff that I wanted to get to, but
so
okay.
When you talk of gone differently, if you had used current European Union examples rather than a historical text, I'm still puzzled about the historical text. Because for me, looking at historical text is almost projecting discourse analysis as involved. There was a Paul Kay paper taking up Fillmore's point. I may have been by the two of them. It was called Ideal Reader, Real Reader, and you know, it's in the back of my mind when I looked at it.
Yeah.
It was just
Check Fillmore. Yeah.
Oh, I thought it was okay. Took it up in another paper. There were working papers. But what I was thinking is, you know, it matters to me. That is critical discourse. Who that reader is right now reading it. Not right now, but when it was first written, and who it was slated for. It doesn't matter how it is. Who it was slated. You know, who was it for? Who was in the minds of the constructor of that text? Who was to have been the reader?
Yes, but we know that more or less. So with these sources that I refer to in the book, I know exactly what the intended readership is. Well, in this specific case, I can't remember offhand, but. Well, this is an advanced book, I think. It's not for small children. No, I think this was a book that was basically intended for, well, as a basis for examinations that had to be taken to get into college, into university. Yes. So, but for all the sources that I'm using there, it is pretty clear what the intended audience is. So, and yes,
Sorry.
Dipti.
Okay, so very quickly, two things. The first is connected to what you just said at the end of your talk, which is that Nana was mentioned in the French text, not in the British text, and the fact that just a few, maybe 10 years earlier, there was a play in which, so it just set me thinking about how, and then this connects to something you said yesterday, where one guy had murdered another in, so what I'm saying is
Daniel Dennett.
So yeah, I mean in your presentation. So what I'm saying is there is some sense of what happened in the world, quote unquote fact, but intertextuality starts playing a role in which facts get narrated and you know they become constructed. So that's quite interesting.
Yeah.
And the second thing I want to say is that, you know, I understand her concern about having a clear idea of what DA is and what CDA is, and my understanding of it is that if your inferences and conclusions of your research are primarily purely textual and grammatical and don't move to questions of power and stuff like that, you could safely call it DA, and if there's any hint of any contextual power related analysis, it moves towards CDA.
Well, so my positioning in relation to all of that is very simply what I said earlier. You have to look at academic affairs as human affairs, right? Within academia, certain groups form groups. They label what they are doing in a specific way, and then the label gets attached to what they are doing. So in the case of critical discourse analysis, well, you've got Norman Fairclough, you've got Ruth Wodak, you've got, to a certain extent, Teun van Dijk, and a number of other things who associate with the label. Now, and then there are, of course, certain characteristics that you might want to associate with them, but which don't even hold for all of them. Like, for instance, you do have the very explicit positioning of Norman Fairclough, who says, well, okay, when I start my research, I just take a very clear political position myself. And that is basically the position that's going to be served by my research. But that's a quite extreme position to take. To a certain extent, on some occasions, Ruth Wodak follows that path too, but she also deviates from that. So she does take clear positions, but she does not make her analyses as dependent on the position as Norman Fairclough does. And so there is variability even in that group, but basically the whole group that is labeled critical discourse analysts is very strongly associated with the taking of clear political positions. But this is not something that in essence ought to distinguish them from other people doing discourse analysis, because they are still under the obligation, if they really want to do analysis, right? An analysis which is equally valuable as the analysis that someone else who does not want to be attached to that label would be doing. So this is all a matter of human history and not much else. So really attaching too much importance to these kinds of labels doesn't get you anywhere. So also with the label of pragmatics, there are, when you go to the international pragmatics conferences, there are probably 80% of the people who go there would not call themselves pragmaticians. No. Many of them would simply call themselves sociolinguists or psycholinguists or anthropological linguists or discourse analysts and so on and so forth. But still, they come together because they have a whole bunch of common concerns, and that's what it's all about. It is the common concerns that we're all pursuing, the common interests that we have. That is what binds us together. And then all these distinctions that you have, they can serve very specific purposes, but in essence, they are not so important. Yeah. That's my position anyway.
Sorry, I couldn't get my answer.
What?
I could not get my answer. I have not got my answer.
You never got your answer?
Yes, I asked 3 questions, but there is no. Sorry? Okay, I can repeat it. This is about something. Effective communication. How can you have effective communication through discourse, pragmatic discourse?
Communication?
Effective.
Effective. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. How can we have effective communication through pragmatic discourse analysis?
Well, you don't get effective communication through pragmatic discourse analysis.
Then is it
the analysis is not aimed at effective communication. The analysis is just aimed at understanding communication, and to a large extent, most communication is effective in many ways, and it is the effectiveness that we also have to analyze. Right? So, for instance, the processes by means of which it is possible for common ideas to spread widely. Analyzing that process is something that you can do with a pragmatic analysis. But that is an investigation that can tell you a little bit about how it comes that certain types of discourse can be effective in a certain way. Now, and then of course, if you're interested in fields of application, so of course it is possible to do things like, okay, with the knowledge that you acquire by analyzing, you can, for instance, go to a media studies school and teach future journalists about this in order, for instance, to help them to avoid some of the possible pitfalls that are there and things like that. So you can apply the knowledge that you acquire through the analysis in a variety of very specific fields. You can also apply it, as I said earlier, by trying to raise an awareness about these processes amongst a wider public, so that it is easier for people to see when, for instance, they have a tendency to just go along with all kinds of presuppositions which they would want to disagree with, but first of all they have to be able to recognize them as presuppositions before they can contest them, right? So you can teach people, you can, and then I use the metaphor again, you can give them a lot of tools, you can let them acquire a lot of tools that they can use in their own confrontation with forms of discourse.
Is there any principle? Is there any principle for the principle in pragmatic discourse analysis? Is there any principle? Principles?
Any principles?
Yes.
Well, there are lots of principles. I mentioned a few on the way when we were going. So the first principle is that if you want to do some sort of analysis, you have to have some sort of intuition that is the basis for a question that you want to ask, and then you have to collect the data that you need in order for you to get a proper answer to your question by means of the methodological tools that pragmatics can provide you with. There are other principles, like another thing that I mentioned was, okay, if you get into the study of a specific piece of discourse, you have to know what the activity type is that you are dealing with and what the expectations are and what the norms are. Another principle is don't jump to conclusions. So don't make a strict form-function link. Always doubt the interpretations that you attach to your observation of specific forms, because there may be other things going on. So there is a whole bunch of principles that you have to use when going through this analysis. And actually, the book Ideological, Language Use is full of those principles.
Paul Grice in 1975, he has written an article, Logic and Conversation. In his article, 4 maxims he has mentioned for cooperative principles. Well, that looks like mysticism kind of things for me. No, not misreading, mysticism kind of thing. Yeah.
I'll be talking about these crises tomorrow.
Okay.
So we will see you at 2:30. Yeah, and please be on time. 2:25 preferably, please.